I know it's a lovely day, so I appreciate you spending a couple hours with me to learn about Mariah Stewart. And I will say my presentation talk has changed just a little bit. That always kind of happens to me because I have an idea and then when I start working on it, it evolves. And so the title of my talk is Mariah Stewart's World, Race, Gender, and the Spiritual Activism of Black Women, 1830 to 1850. You'll notice that I pronounce what looks like Maria as Mariah. That is the way this amazing woman was introduced to me by several scholars. I've also seen her name spelled a few different ways, and so it's just kind of ingrained in me to call her Mariah. So I hope that doesn't confuse anyone when you see her name up there. I wanted to start before jumping into my talk and just tell you a little bit about my history with Mariah Stewart. When I started studying Black women, in graduate school. My undergrad was actually in ethnic studies. But it's amazing because UCSD is now getting ready to start a Black Studies program. So that wasn't there when I went to UCSD, but I'm excited to hear that that's starting. So I started studying Black women when I went to graduate school, and I was firmly grounded in the 20th century. I was especially interested in Black nationalism during the 1920s with women like Amy Jacques Garvey and Queen Mother Moore, and I was enthralled by movements of the 1960s and 70s with fierce women like Angela Davis, Kathleen Cleaver, and Assata Shakur. But during my second semester of graduate school, I took a class on 19th century Black women, speakers, and writers. I thought the class might be interesting. It was actually life-changing. It was a literature course. I'm a historian. But this literature course opened my eyes up to the rich history of Black women's activism that I had never knew existed. And I soon learned that it was actually literary scholars who were trailblazers in really letting us know who some of these amazing early Black women were. And this is a history of activism that goes back hundreds of years. And what I'm sharing with you is just a piece of my dissertation, which I'm still working on. I actually begin in the Revolutionary period. And so my work starts around 1776 and goes all the way up to 1850. That's how far back I'm tracing Black women's activism. It actually goes back even further, but you got to put a stop somewhere. It was in this class that I was first introduced to the speeches and writings of Mariah Stewart. She published her first political essay in 1831 entitled Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality. And in 1832, she became the first American woman to give a political speech before a crowd of both men and women. This was an unthinkable act at the time, especially for Black women. She was second only to one woman, Frances Wright, who was born in England and who spoke politically before a mixed crowd in 1828. Mariah Stewart promoted Black women and saw a place specifically for them in the Black freedom struggle. And at a time when Africa was considered the dark continent, she disrupted demonizing ideas about Africa by highlighting her sense of pride and connection to the land of her ancestors. So this course really opened my mind up and led me on the trajectory that I am on now. I wanted to know more about Stewart and other Black women activists that I was learning about for the first time. And that takes me to where we are now, where I was always questioning who were these women, what motivated them, and most importantly, why did I not know about them? These questions are pretty basic, but ask yourself, what do you know about Black women's activism, and how far back can you go? Now, I'm sure some of you know a ton, especially the couple of you out there who've been in one of my classes. But generally speaking, the history of Black women's activism, especially in the 18th and 19th century, is largely unknown. And that's where my work comes in as I join the ranks of those committed to researching, writing about, teaching, and sharing the stories of these phenomenal Black women. So Mariah Stewart, I would say, is my first love when it comes to history. And she will forever kind of be someone who helps me frame my thinking when looking at these Black women. Methinks I heard a spiritual interrogation. Who shall go forward and take off the reproach that is cast upon the people of color? Shall it be a woman? And my heart made this reply, if it is thy will, be it ever so, Lord Jesus. I begin with this quote that Mariah Stewart delivered In 1832, this was part of her very first speech. I begin with this because it gets into the spiritual aspect of Mariah Stewart's activism and Black women in general, who felt they were called by God to do the work that they would set out. This was especially significant for Black women at a time where women were supposed to be silent and not speak about political issues, because it empowered them to be able to take on this call and act, and in Mariah Stewart's case, to speak. So Franklin Hall, where she delivered this speech, was a major center of abolitionism in Boston, and where the New England Anti-Slavery Society that formed just 1 year before this speech often met. It was the first of 4 groundbreaking lectures that Stewart delivered addressing the position and possibilities of Black people in the United States. In the span of just 1 year, Stewart publicly addressed a number of critical issues: racism, sexism, slavery, capitalism, education, citizenship, white supremacy, and power. She believed strongly that the wealth of the nation had been built on the backs of African Americans, who, in her words, had been the principal foundation and support. In terms of seeing Black people as the principal foundation and support, she said, "We have pursued the shadow, they have obtained the substance. We have performed the labor, they have received the profit. We have planted the vines, they have eaten the fruits of them." This was in 1832, over 30 years before the abolition of slavery in the United States. But Stewart was not just talking about the exploitation of enslaved people, because with few exceptions, the condition of free Black people, as she stated, was but little better than the enslaved. Stewart was not just reflecting on the problems, she was also making a call for action. "We will tell you that it is our gold that clothes you in fine linen and purple and causes you to fare sumptuously every day. And it is the blood of our fathers and the tears of our brethren that have entrenched your soils. And we claim our rights." That's her bolding, not mine, her caps. So it shows just how strongly she felt about this idea of claiming our rights. And I'll get into a little bit later how she actually sued for some of her rights in terms of a property dispute that she had. Stewart's solution was rooted in community, as she argued that the chains of slavery and ignorance could only be broken if Black people united as one. Stewart challenged Black people to take the lead in their own advancement. "If no one will promote or respect us," she said, "let us promote and respect ourselves." Stewart's philosophies placed her among other Black nationalists of her era who believed self-determination, solidarity, and collective action were key to Black liberation. Going further, she presented a gender-inclusive analysis of racial uplift that placed Black women at the center of social justice work. O ye daughters, awake of Africa, awake, awake, arise," she proclaimed, as she called for Black women to distinguish themselves in the struggle for Black freedom and civil rights. She emphasized the importance of women as wives, mothers, teachers, and spiritual leaders, and argued that women's work was necessary in creating a more just world for the next generation. "O woman, woman," she exclaimed, "your example is powerful. Your influence is great. It extends over your husbands and over your children, and throughout the circle of your acquaintance." For Stewart, liberation was on the horizon, and Black women were central to that quest. "It is you," she said, "that must create in the minds of your little girls and boys a thirst for knowledge, a love of virtue, the abhorrence of vice, and the cultivation of pure heart." Stewart placed Black women squarely within the framework of political activism, while at the same time adhering to the gender conventions of the time. Stewart was not the only one who believed women's work would uplift the race. There was a growing belief that Black women were important to racial uplift, so long as they remained in their proper place. Many Black women had already begun to work within that acceptable sphere. The church was often the backdrop to their activities that included benevolent and community service work. Black women raised money, organized sewing circles, and held bazaars in efforts to provide everyday necessities for others. This was more than just charity work, but a way to subsidize the unmet needs of family, friends, and neighbors. The African Dorcas Association in New York City, for example, made clothes and provided school materials for students in the Free African School, a school that Stewart would actually go on to teach for after she would leave Boston, but I'm going to get there. This enabled more children to attend school at a time when education was seen as a tool for liberation. Black women also used sewing circles to make clothes for self-emancipated slaves. Their efforts helped countless freedom seekers avoid capture. This type of work, although not always recognized, was political activism. And it was acceptable at the time because it allowed women to stay within what was considered the woman's sphere, which in turn is why it's often marginalized as simply women's work. Black women's activism in the early antebellum period can be understood in relation to the Republican motherhood ideology that bestowed a political purpose on white women during and after the American Revolution. White women were seen as a source of strength for the new nation. They were charged with raising the sons of liberty, making motherhood their political arm. African American women were obviously excluded from this construction, this ideology, since neither they nor Black men were considered citizens within the United States. Yet and still, there is still a parallel between this ideology and the gender roles that Black people practiced, especially as they moved towards their age of emancipation. Just as white women were seen as important to American independence, albeit in a subordinate role, Black women were valued within the Black freedom struggle so long as they remained in the women's sphere. Thus, while Stewart's right to speak publicly remained questionable, she was likely given some leeway because her message, especially with regards to women's influence, did not disrupt this idea of separate spheres. That, however, changed when she turned her analysis on Black men in her address before the African Masonic Hall on February 27, 1833. The African Masonic Lodge, founded by Prince Hall in 1794, was one of the earliest examples of self-determined Black organizations formed in the face of overt racial discrimination. Its founder, Prince Hall, set a strong anti-slavery tone, orating on the evils of slavery as early as 1797. Several of the lodge's members had prominent roles in the development of other racial uplift organizations. Thomas Dalton and James Barbados, for example, were the president and vice president, respectively, of the Massachusetts General Colored Association, which was organized in the late 1820s to promote the general welfare of all Black people. It was the first expressly anti-slavery society in Massachusetts, preceding the biracial New England Anti-Slavery Society by at least 3 years. David Walker, which some of you may know, was also a member. Stewart was formally excluded from both of these all-male organizations. However, through her speeches, she found a way to engage. It is unclear how and why she was invited to speak. Perhaps it was because of what she was saying to women. But what we can surmise from the documents is that members were outraged when Stewart's topic turned from women's influence to a scathing critique of Black men. Is it blindness of mind, she asked, or stupidity of soul, or want of education that has caused our men 60 and 70 years old never to let their voices be heard, nor their hands be raised in behalf of their color? For Stewart, talk without effort was nothing. And what she saw as the, quote, gross neglect of many Black men made her blood boil. It has even been said that they jeered and threw rotten tomatoes at her. Stewart's words were harsh, but her analysis was in tune with some of the most famed Black activists affiliated with the lodge. Just 2 years earlier, David Walker was also critical of assessments of racism and slavery in the United States. Actually, that was 4 years earlier. In his appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829. Walker was critical of men he sought to inspire, asking how they could be submissive in their own degradation. David Walker's call for armed resistance was unprecedented. And like Stuart, he believed it was time for Black men to step up and prove to the Americans and the world that they were men. Walker's fiery appeal found a widespread audience in Boston and beyond, and was in its third edition within a year of its publication. The appeal was so compelling that it was interpreted by many as the star in the East guiding them to freedom and emancipation. Maria Stuart was deeply influenced by Walker, who she called noble, fearless, and undaunted in her introduction to her very first publication, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality. Yet Stuart was not Walker, and though she shared Walker's undying commitment, she was met with deep criticism because she was a woman. We see this clearly in her farewell address that she delivered on September 21st, 1833. She delivered this address to her so-called friends in the city of Boston. That's actually how she titled this last speech, to her friends in the city of Boston. This is some of what she said. What if I am a woman? Is not the God of ancient times the God of these modern days? Did he not raise up Deborah to be a mother and a judge in Israel? Did not Queen Esther save the lives of the Jews and Mary Magdalene first declare the resurrection of Christ from the dead? Let us not talk of prejudice till prejudice becomes extinct at home. Let us not talk of opposition till we cease to oppose our own. She's clearly talking about the oppression that she faced because she was a woman. Nearly 20 years later, Black abolitionist William C. Nell reflected on the rejection she must have felt in Boston as a travesty and real weakness in the anti-slavery movement. Stuart's farewell speech was her final public lecture. She moved to Williamsburg, New York shortly after, where she would continue her social justice work, albeit in a very different sphere. She was a school teacher and Sunday school leader, and she joined the growing ranks of anti-slavery women, both Black and white, who were paving a way for themselves within the movement. She was a corresponding delegate for the first anti-slavery convention of American women in 1837, held in New York City. And later in life, she would be matron of the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which was built during the Civil War. And although her public speaking was short-lived, she made every effort to have her voice heard and her ideas documented. She published her speeches in The Liberator, the leading abolitionist newspaper at the time, and she did that on her own accord, going to William Lloyd Garrison, who was the editor of the paper, and asking if she could have her work published. She also published her writings, including her religious meditations, in the Productions of Mrs. Maria Stuart, first published in 1835, and then again in 1879, not long before her death. Now, the publication in 1879 is especially significant because how she was able to fund that publication was she was able to get a settlement, because earlier she had lost out on property that was due to her from her husband, who had served in the War of 1812. She never got that property, but she never forgot it. And so she was able to sue on behalf of his allotments that would have come from his service. And that's how she published her work. And the publications of her work is significant because Maria Stuart and a few of the other women that I studied, they took it upon themselves to make sure that their message would be lasting in history. If it were not for them, we may not know about this work. Stuart was exceptional, yet she was far more than her speeches. She was a spiritual leader, an educator, and a radical abolitionist. Her story is one of urgency, limitation, and negotiation. One of spiritual conversion, radical opposition, and women's rights. She represented the epitome of Black women's activism at a time when race was everything, but gender was never absent. We can learn a lot by looking at Stewart's experiences and the world she lived in. As the first Black woman to speak publicly before a crowd of both men and women, she was exceptional, but she was not alone in her commitment to Black people. The barriers she broke and the resistance she faced were a reflection of the society that she and other Black women lived in and fought against. A look at her world allows for a better understanding of not just the limitations placed on Black women, but it lends insight into why they chose the channels of activism that they did. Through Stewart, we can begin to unpack the history of Black women's activism during this first generation of antebellum reform. She was born Mariah Miller in Hartford, Connecticut in 1803, and she was born into a world committed to the cult of domesticity. This patriarchal ideology, also known as the cult of true womanhood, was used to regulate the attitudes and behavior of women. Within this cult, a woman's virtue was defined by her purity, piety, domesticity, and submissiveness. This emphasis on subordination meant that Stewart's world was one where a woman was judged by criteria established by men. But the cult of domesticity involved far more than patriarchy, as it was deeply shaped by both race and class. It was, in fact, a racially exclusive ideology constructed as a standard for middle and upper class white women. This is an important point because there's been minimal attention to the ways race, class, and gender intersected within this cult of domesticity or cult of true womanhood. Many scholars have argued that the cult held women hostage, yet few have acknowledged Black women who were forced to work outside of their home. And this goes for both free and enslaved women. Stewart herself, who was born free, began working as a child servant at the age of 5. African Americans may not have been included in the cult of true womanhood, but they were certainly influenced by this ideology. The free Black community's acceptance of the cult was in many ways an attempt to reclaim the rights that had been denied to African Americans on account of race. Male dominance was seen as the norm in the United States, and freedom was understood in sexist and patriarchal terms. Many Black men believed that if they could just prove to the world that they were men, as David Walker had suggested, then they would be a step closer to full citizenship. African Americans were also trying to combat the racist stereotypes that demonized Black men and women, which reflected the race consciousness and self-determined elements of the patriarchal gender roles that were developing in the Black community. Antebellum Black newspapers fueled this merger of Black nationalism and American patriarchy by printing articles and poems that promoted unequal gender roles as a recipe for freedom. An 1839 article in The Colored American, which was one of the first free Black newspapers, offered a comparative analysis of men and women, stating, "Man is strong, woman is beautiful. Man is daring and confident. Woman is deferent and unassuming. Man is great in action. Woman is suffering. Man shines abroad. Woman at home. Man talks to convince. Women to persuade and please. Man has a rugged heart. Woman a soft and tender one. Man prevents misery. Woman relieves it. Man has science. Woman has taste. Man has judgment. Woman sensibility. Man is being of justice. Woman an angel of mercy." This article was similar to articles on true womanhood that appeared in middle and upper class white journals like Godey's Lady Book. A crucial difference, however, was that African Americans tied the oppressive ideology to their broader struggle for equality. And this was the challenge that Stewart and other Black women faced, struggling for racial equality within a patriarchal society. Black women could join the crusade for Black freedom and full citizenship, but they were not supposed to be outspoken or take on leadership positions. In some instances, Black women confronted patriarchy head-on. We see this in Stuart's farewell speech. More often, however, Black women were forced to work within the growing sphere of respectability that was growing in the Black community. They often did this in collaboration with white women who were also navigating gender subordination at this time. Black women's cooperation with white women and parallel work reflected the 19th century ideologies that created separate spheres for men and women. The collaborations and similarities between Black women are examples also of the ways women manipulated those spheres to be political, to become activists as they themselves matured. Women's groups were supposed to be apolitical, but they used these spaces to do very political work. Stuart moved to Boston around 1820, and she continued to work as a domestic servant until she married James Stuart in 1826. Now, James Stuart was an independent businessman and shipper. He was several years her senior and a veteran of the War of 1812, and his status released Stuart from domestic service and ushered her into the middle-class echelon of Boston's Black community. And to be clear, to be middle class in the antebellum era for Black people was really just recognizing the advancement of a class that was coming out of slavery. Stuart, however, never stopped thinking about the other daughters of Africa who, as she stated, still had to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles. The area that Stuart lived in was often referred to by whites as Nigger Hill and was similar to other predominantly Black neighborhoods throughout the Northeast. Racial segregation meant that the majority of Black people, regardless of occupation, lived in common neighborhoods, patronized each other's businesses, and worshiped together in the same churches. To borrow a contemporary idea from sociologist and historian George Lipsitz, they turned segregation into congregation, which facilitated not only the growth of these free Black communities, but also a network of activism that connected Black people in their respective cities and across the nation. It is no coincidence, then, that James and Maria Stuart were friends and neighbors with some of the most influential Black abolitionists of the time, including David Walker. The Stuarts and the Walkers no doubt knew each other well. They even had a house in common. Though they did not occupy it at the same time, the Stuarts moved into 8 Belknap Street directly after David and his wife Eliza vacated it. This house was also on the same street as the African Meeting House, which served as a central space for racial uplift efforts in Boston. It was home to the First African Baptist Church, housed a schoolroom, and provided a meeting space for anti-slavery groups. The African Meeting House was one of the most important sites of Black community building in the Northeast. It exemplified the ways in which African Americans intertwined secular and sacred spaces in their efforts to create and maintain community. It was home to the First African Baptist Church, founded by Thomas Paul in 1806. This church was part of the larger self-determined Black church movement throughout the Northeast as Black people were establishing their own denominations and congregations so that they could worship free from prejudice. The Stuarts were not official members of the African Baptist Church, but they were well acquainted with Reverend Paul, who had officiated their wedding. Stuart demonstrated an even closer association when she included the First African Baptist Church in the title page of her 1835 publication of the production of Mrs. Maria Stuart. This collection contained her first essay, her public lectures, and her spiritual meditations. It was also advertised widely in The Liberator. The fact that Stuart was so heavily affiliated with the church that she was not a member of is telling of the relationship between spirituality and activism for free Blacks in the antebellum period. The African Baptist Church might not have been her central place of worship, but it was home to those who she shared a commitment with to Black advancement. Now, I began with a quote that reflected Stewart's commitment to Black people, as well as the spiritual platform that framed her work. Stewart indeed believed she had been called by God and linked that call specifically to her sanctification as an evangelical Christian. She believed she was called by God as a woman to fight for Black freedom. This call by God is significant in that it was at the core of everything she did. From the moment I experienced the change, she wrote, I felt a strong desire, with the help and assistance of God, to devote the remainder of my days to piety and virtue, and now possess that spirit of independence that were I called upon, I would willingly sacrifice my life for the cause of God and my brethren. And you'll see there, just even wrapped up in this quote, she has some of these ideas of the cult of true womanhood, but also some of these very radical ideas of Black women asserting themselves in their own terms. Stewart was a spiritual activist, driven by faith and committed to social action. She studied the Bible in and out, which was reflected in her speeches, writings, teaching philosophy, and anti-slavery work. Her message was as much about God, religious education, and sanctification as it was about Black liberation, moral reform, and women's rights. She, for example, like many other Black intellectuals of her time, would often reference Psalm 68:31 when discussing the position and possibilities of Black people in the United States. My heart's desire, she declared, is that Ethiopia might stretch forth her hands unto God. But we have a great work to do. Stewart, like so many other Black Christians and intellectuals of her time, interpreted Psalm 68:31 as a call for the abolition of slavery and the end of racial inequality for Black people in the United States. Black theologians call it the Ethiopian prophecy, an interpretation which grew throughout the 19th century. The full verse, which Stewart references, is princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands under God. Stewart referenced this verse twice in her first publication, Religion and the Pure Principles of Reality, and in 3 out of 4 public speeches, making clear that she believed God had a vision for Black freedom, which she argued was up to Black people to see through. Stewart's faith, then, was part of her armor and what drove her to act. Many will suffer for pleading the cause of oppressed Africa, she wrote, and I shall glory in being one of her martyrs. This was a holy warfare, she proclaimed, and Jesus was her captain. Stewart made clear in her speeches and writings that her ideas about Black freedom were always centered in this call from God. This call was significant to her, not just as a Black person, not just as someone looking to achieve Black freedom, but specifically as a Black woman who was also navigating the confines of sexism and patriarchy within this struggle for social justice and racial equality. Stewart's own spirituality can be traced back to her childhood, and it's one of the few personal details included in her introduction to the productions of Mrs. Mariah Stewart. She notes that she borrowed much of her language from the Bible, which she studied during the years of her childhood and youth. The Bible, I should say, was often the only book that Black people had to access. And so for many, literacy and religion were often linked. Stewart, however, did not publicly profess her religious faith until she was an adult. And it was not long after her husband, James Stewart, who I said was much older than her, died. She writes of being deeply saddened by the loss of her husband, at which point she turned to God for comfort. But beyond comfort, like many Black activists at this time, her religious beliefs were tied to a call to action. This religious awakening opened the door also to what was previously an exclusively male arena of political activism in both the public and private sphere. Stewart, as many scholars have argued, was a doer of the word. She held herself up to the Bible like a mirror and saw a reflection of herself, what mattered, and the change she wanted to see. She gained literacy and political perspective from the religious text, as well as the incentive to act. She was a race-conscious woman, who was dedicated to advancing Black people and using the scripture to assert her spiritual duty and female authority to act. She was also a radical abolitionist who believed Black people would never be free as long as slavery and racism existed. But she was not alone. From Dorina Lee, an itinerant preacher and abolitionist, to Sojourner Truth, arguably the most extraordinary faith-driven woman of her time, Stewart was part of a network of early national and antebellum Black women whose spiritual and revolutionary missions intertwined. All of them were inspired by their belief in God. Moreover, and more importantly, Black women's spirituality translated into a training ground for their secular work. They formed prayer groups, led Sunday schools, attended camp meetings, formed spiritual bands, and belonged to religious organizations. In turn, Black women cultivated organizing skills, social networks, and the confidence to promote social, political, and economic change. These women were especially significant when it came to the political education of other Black women, which fueled their participation in the growing abolitionist movement. Some of the most profound political work actually came from Black women's organizations that did not include white women or Black men. It was, for example, the African American Female Intelligence Society, a Black women's literary society in Boston, that gave Stewart a venue to speak, in which she argued that Black women had an important role in the Black freedom struggle as teachers and spiritual leaders. These women transcended the boundaries of the woman's sphere by educating, politicizing, and empowering each other within the church and their private homes. The most radical women embraced purity, piety, and domesticity while simultaneously challenging the expectation of submissiveness. Mariah Stewart, for instance, declared that she was but a feeble instrument of God when she broke through the gendered walls of public speaking and political protest. And these women didn't always agree. These weren't just spaces of indoctrination. These were spaces to think critically, to strategize, specifically about the role of Black women in this movement. They reflected the fact that Black women, and Black people for that matter, were not monolithic. Their discussions revolved largely around what they were reading in the Black abolitionist papers and the growing movement that they were all part of. I just want to take a moment to introduce you to a couple more women. I wish I could talk about them all, but I must mention the preachers since I'm focusing on spirituality, because when it comes to Black women's activism in this time period, the preaching women are often the most forgotten. Dorina Lee, who was born in 1783 in New Jersey, was the first female preacher of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, established in 1816, and the first African-American woman to publish an autobiography. She chronicled her spiritual journey from being suicidal to sanctified and recorded the sexism that she faced within the AME Church. Like Stewart, Dorina Lee was born free, but she also began working as a domestic servant at the age of 7. One thing really significant about Dorina Lee is she, like Mariah Stewart, used biblical women to argue her case to be admitted and accepted as a preacher, because she was at first denied. Another important woman is a woman by the name of Zilpha Elau. She was an itinerant preacher born in 1790. We're not really clear on her death because she actually moves to England around 1845. She was an itinerant preacher, meaning she preached on her own accord. She didn't need the blessings of any church. She was also deeply committed to Methodism, but considered herself a non-denominational preacher. She preached throughout the nation, including the slaveholding South. And this is especially significant because the words of these preaching women, what they were saying to those who were enslaved, was everything about liberation, calling on stories like the Exodus from the Bible in order to empower Black people, especially those who were enslaved, to understand that God had intended them to be free. In 1840, she took her spiritual message abroad to England. She was just shy a month of making it to the World Anti-Slavery conference for the World the World Anti-Slavery Society that was held. It wasn't held every year, but she missed it by just a couple of months. She stayed, though, and she sent her message throughout England and then came back and published her travels. And that's where we get the memoirs of the life, religious experience, and ministerial travels and labors of Mrs. Elow. Faith for all of these women was a form of resistance as they sought to improve their circumstances and others. Their activism was always spiritually motivated, community-oriented, and anti-slavery to the core. It took place in their homes, their churches, their prayer groups, religious camp meetings, Sabbath schools, secular classrooms, literary and mutual aid societies, sewing clubs, and eventually anti-slavery groups. But the anti-slavery groups were actually formed after all of these other spaces that Black women were operated in. These spaces were often created by and for Black people and reflected the female-centered spheres of Black women's activism in the early national and antebellum periods. And I'll end there. The African Masonic Lodge. And that was actually chartered by Prince Hall. He had to get that charter from England because the Masonic lodges in the United States refused to admit Black people. That's why I say it's one of the earliest forms of self-determination in terms of Black organizing. The Black middle class was growing throughout the antebellum period. And I should say my work starts so early that I literally see the development of the Black middle class. And I wanted to make the distinction because when we think about Black middle class in this day and age, you think of a certain economic kind of bracket, right? But what it really meant is these were folks who were coming out of the menial labor positions. So our first professionals, our first school teachers, preachers were considered part of the Black middle class. And so Black middle class represented not only your economic standing that was coming just out of slavery, but also this growing professional group of Black people throughout the Northeast. And Black communities were growing in this period of time because slavery had just kind of gradually died out in the northeastern regions. You gotta make a distinction. My whole project, I should say, is on the Northeast. And the Northeast, I'm looking at New England, New York, New Jersey, and so Pennsylvania as well. And so I don't look at the South. Even in the women that I look at in the early national period who were among the first to be fighting for freedom, I'm looking solely at the Northeast. But what it looks like is that she associated with whatever church was doing the type of work that she wanted to do. So in Boston, she was most associated with Thomas Paul's Baptist Church. When she moved to New York, she was most affiliated with Peter Williams' Episcopalian Church. The thing about Black women is they were not held down to these separate things and these separate denominations. So she had connections with women like Sarah Douglas, who was a Quaker. Most Black women weren't Quakers, but they were very aware and involved in what Quakers were doing as being among the first to come out against slavery. So she was very much affiliated with some white Quaker women as well. But in terms of the way they operated, it was more about the mission than the denomination. And that's different from men because men get very much tied to their denominations. Women not so much, especially not these preaching women, because they were not getting ordained in the same way that men were. Could she have spoken in the Quaker meetings? She did, but we don't have record of that. Yeah, but she could have spoken in the Quaker meetings, but we have no record. The only records that we have of Stewart's speeches are the ones that she got published on her own, the ones she took to the Liberator, the ones she published in her own publication. But I actually suspect that when she moved to New York, or possibly when she moved to Washington, D.C., that she might have been doing some low-key, not New York. New York was too conservative, but Washington, D.C., she might have. But how I really got interested in Mariah Stewart was I read these amazing speeches, and then that was it. That was it. That's all I knew. After 1833, no one knew anything. And so a lot of my work has been trying to uncover what she was doing. And that's when I see that she went into teaching, into the Sunday schools. But she was clearly not going to step out in the same way that she did in Boston. Boston was actually far more radical in terms of the Black community than New York. So we think that she chose on her own to operate in different spheres. And these were the spheres she advocated for. So it wasn't like she was going against her own mission, but that's where she saw fit. And I think also what happens is not so much that she's blacklisted, is that women were not considered leaders at this time. And so the only people who are thinking and writing about these Black women are these Black women. And so even when it comes to white women's organizations where I have a strong feeling that they were affiliated with Mariah Stewart, they're not making mention of her. And I don't have the evidence when it comes to Mariah Stewart, but absolutely with other Black women who were doing phenomenal things, working alongside white women and Black men, and neither of those groups recognizing it in their own documentation. But Jarena Lee eventually was, because she was actually very close with Richard Allen. Richard Allen, who was the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia and the first bishop, was the one who finally gave his blessing for her. But after he died, people tried to suppress her work. And in fact, in the AME documents, there's writings about Jarena Lee's publication saying that she's kind of making up some stuff, and it's not true, because she talks about the rejection and the resistance to her preaching. And while I don't study the South, I'm teaching enough about it that I'm reading a lot and thinking about it in terms of my own research. But part of the issue for Black people was that women in a patriarchal society, when it came to Black women, they never got the same protections as white women. And so Black men and Black women didn't want women to have to go into the fields and do that type of work, and also didn't want them to be subject to the type of violence and exploitation, specifically sexual violence and exploitation, that they often suffered doing field work. So that was a big piece of it, I would say, in the ways in which it's interpretation, but it's still about something different when we think about Black people. Just because you were not enslaved didn't mean you weren't subjected to servitude. And there was actually a long period of time after the American Revolution where we had what was called gradual emancipation in the Northeast, where Black people were considered born free, but they had to serve out an indenture. Philadelphia is usually the example that I give in my class, where people would have to be indentured till the age of 28. Now, Stewart and Jarena Lee, and Zilpha Elau was a servant as well, too. I just didn't mention it. All three of those women, they weren't part of that gradual emancipation indentured servitude, but what they reflected was poverty. And so Maria Stewart was an orphan. Jarena Lee was poor. And so in order to survive, they got hired out. And so enslaved children were working as early as 6. Same thing as domestic servants. And so that's why Mariah Stewart says that the conditions for free Blacks were little better than the enslaved. Now, that's arguable, obviously, but it shows that she's taking that from her own personal experiences. And that's something that is very significant to my own work. And while I focused on Stewart, who's very much rooted in the antebellum period, looking at early national women, we really see that their perspective about freedom and change and the role of Black women is specifically related to themselves directly coming out of slavery or servitude, which is different from the way Black women's activism is often thought about, because usually people are thinking about Black women's activism after the Civil War, sometimes maybe towards the end of the Civil War, after the Civil War, and then into the 20th century, and at which point we do have a very solidified Black middle class, right? But that wasn't the same when we're talking about the early national period. So part of it is that this type of work isn't considered activism. It's only recently being considered activism that someone like Jarena Lee or Zilpha Elau were activists. In fact, their spiritual work has been looked at as great literary works, but people aren't looking at the fact that they were also attending anti-slavery meetings, that they knew each other, that they preached. Drina Lee and Zulfa Elau actually shared the pulpit at some point, and went to an anti-slavery meeting together. So that's part of it, is some of the work is not recognized, and that's what my research really focuses on, is looking at the impact of Black women's work and also their intentions, and redefining how what we think of as political activism, right? Like my example that I always use is the sewing circles, right? Black women sitting around sewing. But that was to help self-emancipated slaves. And by self-emancipated slaves, I mean fugitive slaves. I just refuse to use that terminology. So that was a piece. The records are very skim. It's tough to find these Black women in the records. And then you have to do a lot of piecing together. And sometimes you have to look at one woman's story and in relation to another. And so it's hard work too. That's a piece of it. And I didn't really talk about it here, but one of the things that I look at in my research is the ways in which women were literally ignored in the records, right? And so they were there, they were working, but there's no acknowledgement in the records that we as historians have to go to and say, okay, this is my evidence, right? So it takes a lot of piecing together. I'll give you one example, and I probably have shared this with anybody who's been in my class. But the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, I should say, that's what I originally thought my dissertation was going to be about, just that one organization. But they were actually known for, having some interracial cooperation as a whole in terms of Boston as a city. But there was some speculation that they had been denying Black women entrance into their anti-slavery society. And so William Lloyd Garrison, who was perhaps the most significant white abolitionist at the time, was set to have a speaking engagement in Boston. And he writes to the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, and he says, I've heard from a really credible source that you guys are not fulfilling our mission, because the radical abolitionist mission was not just about ending slavery, it was also about racial equality as well. Not everybody was really fulfilling that piece. And so he says, I'm not going to come. I'm not going to come and speak before your group because I've heard this. They write back frantically, that's not true. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but they point out that Susan Paul, who's Thomas Paul's daughter of the First African Baptist Church, was their secretary and a leader in their group and doing great work. And I knew that, right? Susan Paul was actually one of the first women to become a life member of the New England Anti-Slavery Society. She oversaw a juvenile choir that would sing at anti-slavery lectures. She was a national leader at the women's conventions. There were 3 different women's conventions. But that was the first time in the records that I saw so much detail about Susan Paul, when the white women that she was working with were claiming that there was no racial discrimination, right? And so there's a lot of ways that they're not recognized. And then on the other side of, because things were, this movement was so much focused on racial equality, that sometimes people didn't want to say who was Black and who was white, because they were like, let's not focus on that. And so when we go back to the records, sometimes it's hard to figure out who's who. And the same thing with women in particular. It's hard to find them. Mariah Stewart gets lost in the records largely because she's not married. And so when she moves to New York, we can't find her because she's not listed in the directories. We find her through her affiliation with the African School and some of her later writings where she actually says what happens. But there's ways in which Black women have been systematically left out of the documents that we're supposed to say this is our history. And so that makes my work quite difficult, actually. One of the things that really, when I say my research began in Boston, I remember I was reading something, and it was page 11. I don't remember I remember the page number exactly where it was, where the author said she wasn't going to deal with Black women. She was writing about abolitionism, women's abolitionism in Boston. She's just because they just weren't significant enough in the organization. And I didn't know much. I just knew, but you have Mariah Stewart, you have Susan Paul. Really, they're not significant enough. And it is hard to find them, but I just refuse to say that that means they weren't there. And so a lot of my dissertation is thinking through some of the silences in the records and what that means. I think it's really significant to say, when we're talking about Black women's abolitionism, to not always want to put them in a framework, right? That's the framework that we know, because that's how they kind of they disappear again. So that's kind of where I say I don't really put a lot of attention into white men unless they are specifically part of a struggle. So I mentioned George Benson. He was very instrumental in what I spoke about last year with Prudence Crandall's school. And then William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison he wasn't just significant in terms of his abolitionist work, but he was promoting women specifically as well. And he was modeling that after Benjamin Lundy, who was also promoting women. Benjamin Lundy, who had a newspaper before The Liberator, The Genius of Universal Emancipation. And so men like Garrison and Lundy, I look at in relation to the ways in which they worked with or allowed women to have space in this movement. Now, I think she would be a feminist. She was considered a proto-feminist, but it's unclear because Stewart was also part of this cult, right? And so these women were operating in this dimension. And so in her writings, she does seem to advocate for the women's sphere, separation, women's work. So she might not be on an extreme end in today's age. But in terms of her fiery fierceness, I would think she'd be doing some serious feminist work. But it's hard with these women because they just don't fit into the models that we have, especially when we start thinking about religion. And religion, it's funny, my advisor always jokes with me because it's not my strong suit, although it's slowly becoming one. And she always says, you cannot understand these Black women unless you understand Black Christianity in this period, right? And that's what I always stress to my students. Like, we're talking about this period when the Second Great Awakening is happening and people are converting in masses, and specifically the message that's being sent is about liberation. And so would they be as tied to the church now? Probably not. A better question, though, would be, not as if that wasn't a bad one, but I could better answer where I think she'd fit in like the early 20th century. I think in the early 20th century, she would have been right alongside club women. I think she would have been right alongside the civil rights movement, probably supporting from the North and writing about it. All right, well, let's give our speaker another round of applause. Thank you.